my connection does not look great today. I will have to check on this later. Yeah, my connection looks terrible. Hold on. I will be checking my channel, make sure the video doesn't look like... Oh, it's bad. Oof. Well, hopefully y'all can hear me. I will be keeping an eye on chat just in case. Yeah, so we finished up The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka on Sunday. Today I thought we would try a short story by a science fiction author who has an award named after her, named Andre Norton. If you look her up, her birth name was like Alice Mary Norton, and she changed it through her life to Andre Norton because the name Andre sold better than the name Alice, I guess. So today we are going to be reading the short story by Andre Norton, All Cats Are Gray. If I could open up the right book, that'd be great. There we go. So yeah, we'll be reading All Cats Are Gray by Andre Norton. And the first subtitle is an odd story made up of oddly assorted elements that include a man, a woman, a black cat, a treasure, and an invisible being that had to be seen to be believed. All cats are gray. Under normal conditions, a whole person has a decided advantage over a handicapped one. But out in deep space, the normal may be reversed for humans, at any rate. Stina of the Spaceways. That sounds just like a corny title for one of those Stellar Veto spreads. I ought to know. I've tried my hand at writing enough of them. Only this Stina was no glamour babe. She was as colorless as a lunar plant. Even the hair netted down to her skull had a sort of grayish cast, and I never saw her but once draped in anything but a shapeless and baggy gray spaceall. Stina was strictly background stuff, and that is where she mostly spent her free hours, in the smelly, smoky background corners of any stellar port dive frequented by free spacers. If you really looked for her, you could spot her just sitting there listening to the talk, listening and remembering. She didn't open her own mouth often, but when she did, spacers had learned to listen, and the lucky few who heard her rare spoken words, these will never forget Stina. She drifted from port to port. Being an expert operator on the big calculator, she found jobs whenever she cared to stay for a time, and she came to be something like the master-minded machines she tended. Smooth, gray, without much personality of their own. But it was Stina who told Bub Nelson about the Jovan Moonrights, and her warning saved Bub's life 6 months later. It was Stina who identified the piece of stone Keen Clark was passing around a table one night, rightly calling it unworked slittite. That started a rush which made 10 fortunes overnight for men who were down to their last jets, and last of all, she cracked the case of the Empress of Mars. All the boys who had profited by her queer store of knowledge and her photographic memory tried at one time or another to balance the scales. But she wouldn't take so much as a cup of canal water at their expense, let alone the credits they tried to push on her. Bub Nelson was the only one who got around her refusal. It was he who brought her Bat. About a year after the Jovan affair, he walked into the free fall one night and dumped Bat down on her table. Bat looked at Stina and growled. She looked calmly back at him and nodded once. From then on they traveled together, the thin gray woman and the big gray tomcat. Bat learned to know the inside of more stellar bars than even most spacers visit in their lifetimes. He developed a liking for vernal juice, drank it neat and quick, right out of a glass, and he was always at home on any table where Stina elected to drop him. This is really the story of Stina, Bat, Cliff Moran, and the Empress of Mars, a story which is already a legend of the spaceways, and it's a damn good story, too. I ought to know, having framed the first version of it myself. For I was there, right in the Rigel Royal, when it all began on the night that Cliff Moran blew in, looking lower than an Ant-Man's belly and twice as nasty. He'd had a spell of luck foul enough to twist a man into a slug snake, and we all knew that there was an attachment out for his ship. Cliff had fought his way up from the back courts of Venaport, lose his ship, and he'd slip back there to rot. He was at the snarling stage that night when he picked out a table for himself and set out to drink away his troubles. However, just as the first bottle arrived, so did a visitor. Stina came out of her corner, Bat curled around her shoulders, stolewise, his favorite mode of travel. She crossed over and dropped down without invitation at Cliff's side. That shook him out of his sulks, because Stina never chose company when she could be alone. If one of the manstones on Ganymede had come stumping in, it wouldn't have made more of us look out of the corner of our eyes. She stretched out one long-fingered hand and set aside the bottle he had ordered, and said only one thing. "It's about time for the Empress of Mars to appear again." Cliff scowled and bit his lip. He was tough as jet lining. You have to be granite, inside and out, to struggle up from Venaport to a ship command, but we could guess what was running through his mind at that moment. The Empress of Mars was just about the biggest prize a spacer could aim for, but in the 50 years she'd been following her queer derelict orbit through space, many men had tried to bring her in, and none had succeeded. A pleasure ship, carrying untold wealth, she had been mysteriously abandoned in space by passengers and crew, none of whom had ever been seen or heard from again. At intervals thereafter she had been sighted, even boarded. Those who ventured into her either vanished or returned swiftly without any believable explanation of what they had seen, wanting only to get away from her as quickly as possible. But the man who could bring her in, or even strip her clean in space, that man would win the jackpot. "All right," Cliff slammed his fist down on the table. "I'll try even that." Stina looked at him, much as she must have looked at Bat the day Bub Nelson brought him to her, and nodded. That was all I saw. The rest of the story came to me in pieces, months later, and in another port half the system away. Cliff took off that night. He was afraid to risk waiting, with a writ out that could pull the ship from under him, and it wasn't until he was in space that he discovered his passengers, Stina and Bat. We'll never know what happened then. I'm betting that Stina made no explanation at all. She wouldn't. It was the first time she had decided to cash in on her own tip, and she was there. That was all. Maybe that point weighed with Cliff. Maybe he just didn't care. Anyway, the three were together when they sighted the Empress riding, her deadlights gleaming, a ghost ship in night space. She must have been an eerie sight, because her other lights were on too. In addition to the red warnings at her nose, she seemed alive, a flying Dutchman of space. Cliff worked his ship skillfully alongside and had no trouble in snapping magnetic lines to her lock. Some minutes later, the three of them passed into her. There was still air in her cabins and corridors, air that bore a faint, corrupt taint which set Bat to sniffing greedily and could be picked up even by the less sensitive human nostrils. Cliff headed straight for the control cabin, but Stina and Bat went prowling. Closed doors were a challenge to both of them, and Stina opened each as she passed, taking a quick look at what lay within. The fifth door opened on a room which no woman could leave without further investigation. I don't know who had been housed there when the Empress left port on her last lengthy cruise. Anyone really curious can check back on the old photo reg cards, but there was a lavish display of silks trailing out of 2 travel kits on the floor, a dressing table crowded with crystal and jeweled containers along with other lures for the female which drew Stina in. She was standing in front of the dressing table when she glanced into the mirror, glanced into it, and froze. Over her right shoulder, she could see the spider silk cover on the bed. Right in the middle of that sheer, gossamer expanse was a sparkling heap of gems, the dumped contents of some jewel case. Bat had jumped to the foot of the bed and flattened out his cat's will, watching those gems, watching them, and something else. Stina put out her hand blindly and caught up the nearest bottle. As she unstoppered it, she watched the mirrored gem. A gemmed bracelet rose from the pile, rose in the air and tinkled its siren song. It was as if an idle hand played. Bat spat almost noiselessly, but he did not retreat. Bat had not yet decided his course. She put down the bottle. Then she did something which perhaps few of the men she had listened to through the years could have done. She moved, without hurry or sign of disturbance, on a tour about the room. And although she approached the bed, she did not touch the jewels. She could not force herself to that. It took her 5 minutes to play out her innocence and unconcern. Then it was Bat who decided the issue. He leaped from the bed and escorted something to the door, remaining a careful distance behind. Then he mewed loudly, twice. Stina followed him and opened the door wider. Bat went straight on down the corridor, as intent as a hound on the warmest of scents. Stina strolled behind him, holding her pace to the unhurried gait of an explorer. What sped before them was invisible to her, but Bat was never baffled by it. They must have gone into the control cabin almost on the heels of the unseen, if the unseen had heels, which there was good reason to doubt, for Bat crouched just within the doorway and refused to move on. Stina looked down the length of the instrument panels and officers' station seats to where Cliff Moran worked. On the heavy carpet, her boots made no sound, and he did not glance up, but sat, humming through set teeth as he tested the tardy and reluctant responses to buttons which had not been pushed in years. To human eyes, they were alone in the cabin, but Bat still followed a moving something with his gaze, and it was something which he had at last made up his mind to distrust and dislike. For now, he took a step or two forward and spat, his loathing made plain by every raised hair along his spine, and in that same moment Stina saw a flicker of vague outline against Cliff's hunched shoulders, as if the invisible one had crossed the space between them. But why had it been revealed against Cliff, and not against the back of one of the seats, or against the panels, the walls of the corridor, or the cover of the bed where it had reclined and played with its lute? What could Bat see? The storehouse memory that had served Stina so well through the years clicked open a half-forgotten door. With one swift motion, she tore loose her spaceall and flung the baggy garment across the back of the nearest seat. Bat was snarling now, emitting a throaty, rising cry that was his hunting song, but he was edging back towards Stina's feet, shrinking from something he could not fight, but which he faced defiantly. If he could draw it after him, past that dangling spaceall, he had to. It was their only chance. What the? Cliff had come out of his seat and was staring at them. What he saw must have been weird enough. Stina, bare-armed and shouldered, her usually stiffly netted hair falling wildly down her back. Stina, watching empty space with narrowed eyes and set mouth, calculating a single, wild chance. Bat, crouched on his belly, retreating from thin air, step by step, and wailing like a demon. "Toss me your blaster." Stina gave the order calmly, as if they still sat at their table in the Rigel Royal, and as quietly Cliff obeyed. She caught the small weapon out of the air with a steady hand, caught and leveled it. "Stay just where you are," she warned. "Back, Bat."
Bring it back.
With a last, throat-splitting screech of rage and hate, Bat twisted to safety between her boots. She pressed with thumb and forefinger, firing at the spacealls. The material turned to powdery flakes of ash, except for certain bits which still flapped from the scorched heat, as if something had protected them from the force of the blast. Bat sprang straight up in the air with a scream that tore their ears. "What?" began Cliff again. Stina made a warning motion with her left hand. "Wait!" She was still tense, still watching Bat. The cat dashed madly around the cabin twice, running crazily with white-ringed eyes and flecks of foam on his muzzle. Then he stopped abruptly in the doorway, stopped and looked back over his shoulder for a long, silent moment. He sniffed delicately. Stina and Cliff could smell it too now. A thick, oily stench which was not the usual odor left by an exploding blaster shell. Bat came back, treading daintily across the carpet, almost on the tips of his paws. He raised his head as he passed Stina, and then he went confidently beyond to sniff and spit twice at the unburned strips of the spaceall. Having thus paid his respects to the late enemy, he sat down calmly and set to washing his fur with deliberation. Stina sighed once and dropped into the navigator's seat.
"Maybe now you'll tell me what in the hell's happened?"
Cliff exploded as he took the blaster out of her hand.
"Gray," she said dazedly. "It must have been gray, or I couldn't have seen it like that. I'm colorblind, you see. I can only see shades of gray. My whole world is gray, like Bat. His world is gray too, all gray. But he's been compensated, for he can see above and below our range of color vibrations, and apparently so can I." Her voice quavered, and she raised her chin with a new air Cliff had never seen before, a sort of proud acceptance. She pushed back her wandering hair, but she made no move to imprison it under the heavy net again. "That is why I saw the thing when it crossed between us. Against your spaceall, it was another shade of gray, an outline. So I put out mine and waited for it to show against that. It was our only chance, Cliff. It was curious at first, I think, and it knew we couldn't see it, which is why it waited to attack, but when Bat's actions gave it away, it moved. So I waited to see that flicker against the spaceall, and then I let him have it. It's really very simple." Cliff laughed a bit shakily. "But what was this gray thing? I don't get it." "Well, I think it was what made the Empress a derelict. Something out of space, maybe, or from another world somewhere." She waved her hands. "It's invisible because it's a color beyond our range of sight. It must have stayed in here all these years, and it kills, it must, when its curiosity is satisfied." Swiftly she described the scene in the cabin and the strange behavior of the gem pile which had betrayed the creature to her. Cliff did not return his blaster to its holder. "Any more of them on board, you think?" He didn't look pleased at the prospect. Stina turned to Bat. He was paying particular attention to the space between the two front toes in the process of a complete bath. "I don't think so, but Bat will tell us if there are. He can see them clearly, I believe." But there weren't any more, and 2 weeks later Cliff, Stina, and Bat brought the Empress into the lunar quarantine station, and that is the end of Stina's story because, as we have been told, happy marriages need no chronicles. And Stina had found someone who knew of her gray world and did not find it too hard to share with her, someone besides Bat. Turned out to be a real love match. The last time I saw her, she was wrapped in a flame-red cloak from the looms of Rigel and wore a fortune in Jovan rubies blazing on her wrists. Cliff was flipping a 3-figure credit bill to a waiter, and Bat had a row of Vernal juice glasses set up before him, just a little family party out on the town. Oh, is that it? I thought that short story would be longer. Good news. I downloaded another story by Andre Norton because I thought that would take much longer, and I guess it didn't. So I guess we will go ahead and continue into the novella Plague Ship, also by Andre Norton. It was written in 1956. Again, it's going to be sci-fi, so feel free to stick with me as we start on Plague Ship by Andre Norton. Chapter 1. Perfumed Planet. Dane Thorson, Cargo Master Apprentice of the Solar Queen, Galactic Free Trader Spacer, Terra Registry, stood in the middle of the ship's cramped bather while Rip Shannon, Assistant Astrogator and his senior in the service of trade by some 4 years, applied gobs of highly scented paste to the skin between Dane's rather prominent shoulder blades. The small cabin was thickly redolent with spicy odors, and Rip sniffed appreciatively. You're sure gonna be about the best smelling Terran who's ever set boot on Sargol's soil. His soft slur of speech ended in a rich chuckle. Dane snorted and tried to estimate progress over one shoulder. The things we have to do for trade. His comment carried a hint of the present embarrassment. Get it well in. This stuff's supposed to hold for hours. It better. According to Van, those Salariki can talk your ears right off your head and say nothing worth hearing, and we have to sit and listen until we get a straight answer out of them. Phew! He shook his head. In such close quarters, the scent, pleasing as it was also overpowering. We would have to pick such a world as this. Rip's dark fingers halted their circular motion. Dane, don't you go talking against this venture. We got it soft, and we're going to be credit happy if it works out, but perversely, Dane held to a gloomier view of the immediate future. If, he repeated. There's a galaxy of ifs in this Sargol proposition. All very well for you to rest easy on your fins. You don't have to run about smelling like a spice works before you can get the time of day from one of the natives. Rip put down the jar of cream. Different worlds, different customs, he iterated to the old tag of the service. Be glad this one's so easy to conform to. There are some I can think of. There. He ended his massage with a stinging slap. You're all evenly greased. Good thing you don't have Van's bulk to cover. Takes him a good hour to get his cream on, even with Frank helping to spread. Your clothes ought to be steamed up and ready too by now. He opened a tight wall cabinet, originally intended to sterilize clothing which might be contaminated by contact with organisms inimical to Terrans. A cloud of steam fragrant with the same spicy scent poured out. Dane gingerly tugged loose his trade uniform, its brown, silky fabric damp on his skin as he dressed. Luckily, Sargol was warm. When he stepped out on its ruby-tinted soil this morning, no lingering taint of his off-world origin must remain to disgust the sensitive nostrils of the Salariki. He supposed he would get used to this process. After all, this was the first time he had undergone the ritual. But he couldn't lose the secret conviction that it was all very silly. Only what Rip had pointed out was the truth. One adjusted to the customs of aliens, or one didn't trade. And there were other things he might have had to do on other worlds which would have been far more upsetting to that core of private fastidiousness which few would have suspected existed in his tall, lanky frame. Whew, out in the open with ya. Ali Camille, apprentice engineer, screwed his 2 regular features into an expression of extreme distaste and waved Dane by him in the corridor. For the sake of his shipmates' olfactory nerves, Dane hurried on to the port, which gave on the ramp now tying the Queen to Sargol's crust. But there he lingered, waiting for Van Rieck, the cargo master of the Spacer, and his immediate superior. It was early morning, and now that he was out of the confinement of the ship, the fresh morning winds cut about him, rippling through the blue-green grass forest beyond to take much of his momentary irritation with them. There were no mountains in this section of Sargol, the highest elevations being rounded hills tightly clothed with the same 10-foot grass which covered the plains. From the Queen's observation ports, one could watch the constant ripple of the grass, so that the planet appeared to be largely clothed in a shimmering, flowing carpet. To the west were the seas, stretches of shallow water so cut up by strings of islands that they more resembled a series of salty lakes. And it was what was to be found in those seas which had lured the Solar Queen to Sargol. Though by rights, the discovery was that of another trader, Traxt Cam, who had bid for trading rights to Sargol, hoping to make a comfortable fortune, or at least expenses, with a slight profit in the perfume trade, exporting from the scented planet some of its most fragrant products. But once on Sargol, he had discovered the Koros stones, gems of a new type, a handful of which, offered across the board in one of the interplanet trading marts, had nearly caused a riot among bidding gem merchants, and Cam had been well on the way to becoming one of the princes of trade when he had been drawn into the vicious net of the Limbian pirates and finished off. Because they too had stumbled into the trap which was Limbo, and had had a very definite part in breaking up that devilish installation, the crew of the Solar Queen had claimed as their reward the trading rights of the Traxt Cam in default of legal heirs. And so here they were on Sargol, with the notes left by Cam as their guide, and as much lore concerning the Salariki as was known crammed into their minds. Dane sat down on the end of his ramp, his feet on Sargolian soil, thin, red soil with glittering bits of gold flake in it. He did not doubt that he was under observation from hidden eyes, but he tried to show no sign that he guessed it. The adult Salariki maintained at all times an attitude of aloof and complete indifference toward the traders, but the juvenile population were as curious as their elders were contemptuous. Perhaps there was a method of approach in that. Dane considered the idea. Van Riki and Captain Jellicoe had handled the first negotiations, and the process had taken most of a day, the result totaling exactly nothing. In their contacts with the off-world men, the feline-ancestored Salariki were ceremonious, wary, and completely detached. But Cam had gotten to them somehow, or he would not have returned from his first trip with that pouch of Koros stones. Only, among his records salvaged on Limbo, he had left absolutely no clue as to how he had beaten down native sales resistance. It was baffling. But patience had to be the middle name of every trader, and Dane had complete faith in Van. Sooner or later, the cargo master would find a key to unlock the Salariki. As if the thought of Dane's chief had summoned him, Van Riki, his scented tunic sealed to his bull's neck in unaccustomed trimness, his cap on his blond head, strode down the ramp, broadcasting waves of fragrance as he moved. He sniffed vigorously as he approached the assistant, and then nodded in approval. "So you're all greased and ready. Is the captain coming too, sir?" Van Riki shook his head. "This is our headache. Patience, my boy, patience." He led the way through a thin screen of the grass on the other side of the scorched landing field to a well-packed earth road. Again, Dane felt eyes, knew that they were being watched, but no Salaric had stepped out of concealment. Excuse me. At least they had nothing to fear in the way of an attack. Traders were immune, taboo, and the trading stations were set up under the white diamond shield of peace, a peace guaranteed on blood oath by every clan chieftain in the district. Even in the midst of interclan feuding, deadly enemies met in amity under that shield and would not turn claw-knife against each other within a 2-mile radius of its protection. The grass forest rustled betrayingly, but the Terrans displayed no interest in those who spied upon them. An insect with wings of brilliant green gauze detached itself from the stalk of a grass tree and fluttered ahead of the traders as if it were an official herald. From the red soil crushed by their boots arose a pungent odor which fought with the scent they carried with them. Dane swallowed 3 or 4 times and hoped that his superior officer had not noticed that sign of discomfort, though Van Riki, in spite of his general air of sleepy benevolence and careless goodwill, noticed everything, no matter how trivial, which might have a bearing on the delicate negotiations of galactic trade. He had not climbed to his present status of expert cargo master by overlooking anything at all. Now he gave an order. "Take an equalizer." Dane reached for his belt pouch, flushing, fiercely determined inside himself that no matter how smells warred about him that day, he was not going to let it bother him. He swallowed the tiny pellet Medic Tau had prepared for just such trials and tried to occupy his mind with the work to come. If there would be any work, or would another long day be wasted in futile speeches of mutual esteem which gave formal lip service to trade and its manifest benefits? Ho! The cry, which was half wail, half arrogant warning, sounded along the road behind him. Van Rieke's stride did not vary. He did not turn his head, show any sign he had heard that heralding fanfare for a clan chieftain, and he continued to keep to the exact center of the road. Deigned the regulation one pace to the rear and left as befitted his lower rank. How! The blast from the throat of a Salaric especially chosen for his lung power was accompanied now by the hollow drum of many feet. The Terrans neither looked around nor withdrew from the center, nor did their pace quicken. That, too, was in order, Dane knew. To the rank-conscious Salarique clansmen you did not yield precedence unless you wanted at once to acknowledge your inferiority, and if you did that by some slip of admission or omission, there was no use in trying to treat face to face with their chieftains again. How! The blast behind was a scream as the retinue it announced swept around the bend in the road to catch sight of the two traders oblivious of it. Dane longed to be able to turn his head just enough to see which one of the local lordlings they blocked. How? There was a questioning note in the cry now, and the heavy thud of feet was slacking. The clan party had seen them, were hesitant about the wisdom of trying to shove them aside. Van Rieke marched steadily onward, and Dane matched his pace. They might not possess a leather-lunged herald to clear their road, but they gave every indication of having the right to occupy as much of it as they wished, and that unruffled poise had its effect upon those behind. The pound of feet slowed to a walk which would keep a careful distance behind the two Terrans. It had worked. The Salarique, or these Salarique, were accepting them at their own valuation, a good omen for the day's business. Dane's spirits rose, but he schooled his features into a mask as wooden as his superiors. After all, this was a very minor victory, and they had 10 or 12 hours of polite and hidden maneuvering before them. The Solar Queen had set down as closely as possible to the trading center marked on Traxcam's private map, and the Terrans now had another 5 minutes' march in the middle of the road ahead of the chieftain, who must be inwardly boiling at their presence, before they came out in the clearing containing the roofless, circular erection which served the Salarique of the district as a marketplace and a common meeting ground for truce talks and the mending of private clan alliances. Erect on a pole in the middle, towering well above the nodding fronds of the grass trees, was the pole bearing the trade shield which promised not only peace to those under it, but a 3-day sanctuary to any feuder or duelist who managed to win to it and lay hands upon its weathered standard. They were not the first to arrive, which was also a good thing. Gathered in small groups about the walls of the council place were personal attendants, liege warriors, and younger relatives of at least 4 or 5 clan chieftains. But, Dane noted at once, there was not a single curtained litter or riding oracle to be seen. None of the feminine part of the Salarique species had arrived. Nor would they until the final trade treaty was concluded and established by their fathers, husbands, or sons. With the assurance of one who was master in his own clan, Van Rieke, displaying no interest at all in the shifting mass of lower-rank Salarique, marched straight on to the door of the enclosure. 2 or 3 of the younger warriors got to their feet, their brilliant cloaks flicking out like spreading wings, but when Van Rieke did not even lift an eyelid in their direction, they made no move to block his path. As fighting men, Dane thought, trying to study the specimens before him with a totally impersonal stare, the Salarique were an impressive lot. Their average height was close to 6 feet, their distant feline ancestry apparent only in small vestiges. The Salaric's nails on both hands and feet were retractile. His skin was gray, his thick hair close to the texture of plushy fur extended down his backbone and along the outside of his well-muscled arms and legs, and was tawny yellow, blue-gray, or white. To Terran eyes, The broad faces, now all turned in their direction, lacked readable expression. The eyes were large, and set slightly aslant in the skull, being startlingly orange-red or brilliant turquoise green-blue. They wore loincloths of brightly dyed fabrics, with wide sashes forming corselets about their slender middles, from which gleamed the gem-set hilts of their claw-knives, the possession of which proved their adulthood. Cloaks as flamboyant as their other garments hung in bat-wing folds from their shoulders, and each and every one moved in an invisible cloud of perfume. Brilliant as the assemblage of liege men without had been, the gathering of clan leaders and their upper officers within the council place was a riot of color and odor. The chieftains were installed on the wooden stools, each with a small table before him on which rested a goblet bearing his own clan sign, a folded strip of patterned cloth, his trade shield, and a gemmed box containing the scented paste he would use for refreshment during the ordeal of the conference. A breeze fluttered sash ends and tugged at cloaks. Otherwise, the assembly was motionless and awesomely quiet. Still making no overtures, Van Rieke crossed to a stool and table which stood a little apart and seated himself. Dane went into the action required of him. Before his superior he set out a plastic pocket flask, its color as alive in the sunlight as the crudely cut gems which the Salarichi sported, a fine silk handkerchief, and last of all, a bottle of Terran smelling salts provided by Medic Tau as a necessary restorative after some hours' combination of Salarichi oratory and Salarichi perfumes. Having thus done the duty of liege man, Dane was at liberty to seat himself cross-legged on the ground behind his chief, as the other sons, heirs, and advisers had gathered behind their lords. The chieftain whose arrival they had in a manner delayed came in after them, and Dane saw that it was Fashtor, another piece of luck, since that clan was a small one and the chieftain had little influence. Had they so slowed Halfur or Paft, it might be a different matter altogether. Fashtor was established at his seat, his belongings spread out, and Dane, counting unobtrusively, was certain that the council was now complete. 7 clans Traxcam had recorded divided the sea-coast territory, and there were 7 chieftains here, indicative of the importance of this meeting, since some of these clans beyond the radius of the shield piece must be fighting a vicious blood feud at that very moment. Yes, 7 were here. Yet there still remained a single stool directly across the circle from Van Rieke. An empty stool. Who was the latecomer? The question was answered almost as it flashed into Dane's mind, but no Salarichi lordling came through the door. Dane's self-control kept him in place even after he caught the meaning of the insignia emblazoned across the newcomer's tunic. Traitor. And not only a traitor, but a company man. But why? And how? The companies only went after big game. This was a planet thrown open to free traders, the independence of the star lanes. By law and right, no company man had any place here unless... Behind a face, Dane strove to keep as impassive as Van's, his thoughts raced. Traxcam, as a free trader, had bid for the right to exploit Sargol when its sole exportable product was deemed to be perfume, a small, unimportant trade as far as the companies were concerned. And then the Koros stones had been found, and the importance of Sargol must have boomed as far as the big boys could see. They probably knew of Traxcam's death as soon as the patrol report on Limbo had been sent to headquarters. The companies all maintained their private information and espionage services, and with Traxcam dead without an heir, they had seen their chance and moved in, only, Dane's teeth set firmly, they didn't have the ghost of a chance now. Legally, there was only one trader on Sargol, and that was the Solar Queen. Captain Jellicoe had his records signed by the patrol to prove that, and all this intersolar man would do now was to bow out and try poaching elsewhere. But the IS man appeared to be in no haste to follow that only possible course. He was seating himself with arrogant dignity on that unoccupied stool, and a younger man in IS uniform was putting before him the same type of equipment Dane had produced for Van Rieke.
The cargo master of the Solar Queen showed no surprise if the Icy's appearance had been such to him. One of the younger warriors in Path's train got to his feet and brought his hands together with a clap, which echoed across the silent gathering with the force of an archaic, solid projectile shot. A Salaric, wearing the rich dress of the upper ranks but also the collar forced upon a captive taken in combat, came into the enclosure carrying a jug in both hands. Preceded by Path's son, he made the rounds of the assembly, pouring a purple liquid from his jug into the goblet before each chieftain, a goblet which Path's heirs tasted ceremoniously before it was presented to the visiting clan leader. When they paused before Van Rieke, the Salaric nobleman touched the side of the plasta flask in token. It was recognized that off-world men must be cautious over the sampling of local products, and that when they joined in the taking of the first cup of peace, they did so symbolically. Paft raised his cup, his gesture copied by everyone around the circle. In the harsh tongue of his race, he repeated a formula so archaic that few of the Salariki could now translate the sing-song words. They drank, and the meeting was formally opened. But it was an elderly Salaric seated to the right of Halfor, a man who wore no claw knife and whose dusky yellow cloak and sash made a subdued note amid the splendor of his fellows, who spoke first, using the click-clack of the trade lingo his nation had learned from Cam. Under the white, he pointed to the shield aloft, we assembled to hear many things, but now come two tongues to speak where once there was but one father of a clan. Tell us, Outlanders, which of you must we now hark to in truth? He looked from Van Rieke to the IS representative. The cargo master from the Queen did not reply. He stared across the circle at the company man. Dane waited eagerly. What was the IS man going to say to that? But the fellow did have an answer, ready and waiting. It is true, father of clans, that here are two voices, where by right and custom there should be only one. But this is a matter which can be decided between us. Give us leave to withdraw from your sight and speak privately together. Then he who returns to you will be the true voice, and there shall be no more division. It was Paft who broke in on before Halfor's spokesman could reply. It would have been better to have spoken together before you came to us. Go, then, until the shadow of the shield is not, then return hither and speak truly. We do not wait upon the pleasure of Outlanders. A murmur approved that tart comment. Until the shadow of the shield is not. They had until noon. Van Rieke arose, and Dane gathered up his chief's possessions. With the same superiority to his surroundings he had shown upon entering, the cargo master left the enclosure, the ICs following. But they were away from the clearing, out upon the road back to the Queen before the two from the company caught up with him. Captain Grange will see you right away, the icy cargo master was beginning when Van Rieke met him with a quelling stare. If you poachers have anything to say, you say it at the Queen and to Captain Jellicoe, he stated flatly, and started on. Above his tight tunic collar the other's face flushed. His teeth flashed as he caught his lower lip between them as if to forcibly restrain an answer he longed to make. For a second he hesitated, and then he vanished down a side path with his assistant. Van Rieke had gone a quarter of the distance back to the ship before he spoke. I thought it was too easy, he muttered. Now we're in for it. Maybe right up by the rockets. By the spiked tail of Exol, this is certainly not our lucky day. He quickened pace until they were close to trotting. Chapter 2. Rivals. That's far enough, Icy. Although traders by law and tradition carried no more potent personal weapons except in times of great crisis than hand sleep rods, the resultant shot from the latter was just as unpleasant for the temporary periods as a more forceful beam. And the threat of it was enough to halt the three men who had come to the foot of the Queen's ramp and who could see the rod held rather negligently by Ali. Ali's eyes were anything but negligent, however, and free traders had reputations to be respected by their rivals of the companies.
The very nature of their roving lives taught them savage lessons, which they either learned or died. Dane, glancing down over the engineer apprentice's shoulder, saw that Van Rieke's assumption of confidence had indeed paid off. They had left the trade enclosure of the Salarique barely 3/4 of an hour ago, but below now stood the bebadged captain of the IS ship and his cargo master. "I want to speak to your captain," snarled the IC officer. Ali registered faint amusement, an expression which tended to rouse the worst in the spectator, as Dane knew of old when that same mocking appraisal had been turned on him as the rawest of the Queen's crew. "But does he wish to speak to you?" countered Camille. "Just stay where you are, Icy, until we're sure about that fact." That was his cue to act as messenger. Dane retreated into the ship, and he swung up the ladder to the command section. As he passed Captain Jellicoe's private cabin, he heard the muffled squall of the commander's unpleasant pet, Queeks, the Hoobat, a nightmare combination of crab, parrot, and toad wearing a blue feather coating and inclined to scream and spit at all comers. Since Queeks would not be howling in that fashion if its master was present, Dane kept on to the control cabin, where he blundered in upon an executive-level conference of captain, cargo master, and astrogator. "Well?" Jellicoe's blaster-scarred left cheek twitched as he snapped that impatient inquiry at the messenger. "I see Captain below, sir, with his cargo master. They want to see you." Jellicoe's mouth was a straight line, his eyes very hard. By instinct, Dane's hand went to the grip of the sleep rod slung at his belt, when the old man put on his fighting face. "Look out. Here we go again," he told himself, speculating as to just what type of action lay before them now. "Oh, they do they?" Jellicoe began, and then throttled down the temper he could put under iron control when and if it were necessary. "Very well. Tell them to stay where they are. Van, will go down." For a moment, the cargo master hesitated. His heavy-lidded eyes looked sleepy. He seemed almost disinterested in the suggestion, and when he nodded, it was with the air of someone about to perform some boring duty. "Right, sir." He wriggled his heavy body from behind the small table, resealed his tunic, and settled his cap with as much precision as if he were about to represent the Queen before the assembled nobility of Sargol. Dane hurried down the ladders, coming to a halt beside Ali. It was the turn of the man at the foot of the ramp to bark an impatient demand. "Well?" Was that the theme word of every captain's vocabulary? "You wait," Dane replied with no inclination to give the IC officer any courtesy address. Close to a Terran year aboard the Solar Queen had inoculated him with pride in his own section of service. Excuse me. A free trader was answerable to his own officers and to no one else on Earth, or among the stars, no matter how much discipline and official etiquette the companies used to enhance their power. He half expected the IS officers to leave after an answer such as that. For a company captain to be forced to wait upon the convenience of a free trader must be galling in the extreme. And the fact that this one was doing just that was an indication that the Queen's crew did perhaps have the edge of an advantage in any coming bargain. In the meantime, the icy contingent fumed below, while Ali lounged whistling against the exit port, playing with his sleep rod, and Dane studied the grass forest. His boot nudged a packet just inside the port casing, and he glanced inquiringly from it to Ali. "Cat ransom," the other answered his unspoken question. So that was it. The fee for Sinbad's return. "What is it today?" "Sugar, about a tablespoonful," the engineer assistant returned, "and 2 colored steelos. So far, they haven't run up the price on us. I think they're sharing out the spoil evenly. A new cub brings him back every night." As did all Terran ships, the Solar Queen carried a cat as an important member of the regular crew, and the portly Sinbad before their landing on Sargol had never presented any problem. He had done his duty of ridding the ship of unusual and usual pests and cargo despoilers with dispatch, neatness, and energy, and when in port on alien worlds he had never shown any inclination to go a-roving. but the sense of Sargol had apparently intoxicated him, shearing away his solid dignity and middle-aged dependability. Now Sinbad flashed out of the Queen at the opening of her port in the early morning, and was brought back protesting with both voice and claws at the end of the day by that member of the juvenile population whose turn it was to collect the standing reward for his forceful delivery. Within 3 days it had become an accepted business transaction which satisfied everyone but Sinbad. The scrape of metal boot soles on ladder rungs warned of the arrival of their officers. Ali and Dane withdrew down the corridor, leaving the entrance open for Jellicoe and Van Rika. Then they drifted back to witness the meeting with the Ices. There were no prolonged greetings between the two parties, no offer of hospitality as might have been expected between Terrans on an alien planet a quarter of the galaxy away from the Earth which had given them a common heritage. Jellicoe, with Van Riki at his shoulder, halted before he stepped from the ramp, so that the 3 intersolar men, captain, cargo master, and escort, whether they wished or no, were put in the disadvantageous position of having to look up to a captain whom they, as members of one of the powerful companies, affected to despise. The lean, well-muscled, trim figure of the Queen's commander gave the impression of a hard-bitten force held in check by will control, just as his face, under its thick layer of space burn, was that of an adventurer accustomed to make split-second decisions, an estimate underlined by that seam of blaster burn across one flat cheek. Van Riki, with a slight change of dress, could have been a company man in the higher ranks, or so the casual observer would have placed him until an observer marked the eyes behind those sleepy drooping lids, or caught a certain note in the calm, unhurried drawl of the voice. To look at the 2 senior officers of the free trading spacer were the antithesis of each other. In action they were each half of a powerful steamroller whole, as a good many men in the service scattered over 6 or so planets had discovered to their cost in the past. Now Jellicoe brought the heels of his space boots together with an extravagant click, and his hand flourished at the fore of his helmet in a gesture which was better suited to the patrol hero of a slightly out-of-date video serial. And I think, because we are not going to finish this exchange by the end of the stream, that I'm going to leave off there, and we'll pick up with that on Sunday. So I hope you will join me as we continue reading The Plague Ship on Sunday. And I hope you have a good rest of your week, a good night. Stay safe out there. I know there's a lot of bad weather happening right now. And I hope to see you Sunday. Good night.